Lovely. Well, thanks for joining me on this very lovely evening. I'm really delighted to be here today to spend 40 minutes or so exploring our attitudes to nature and conservation. As Zoe said, I work for the Wildlife Trust as an analyst, and a big part of my role is trying to understand what sorts of actions we're taking for nature, how much nature matters to us, and the general state of our relationship with nature. It's worth saying also that I've worked in various roles across the sector, including as a marine biologist in the Northern Ireland Environment Agency and in research with a focus on invasive species and predator ecology. I guess what that means is that I'm looking to bring some varied perspectives to our session today, not just with my Wildlife Trust hat on. And actually, I think much of what I have to say is necessarily in a personal capacity, because wherever I'm talking about attitudes and values, I'm going to relate them to my own personal attitudes and values rather than, let's say, a position of the Wildlife Trust or a position of Devon Wildlife Trust. So, what do I want to do with you today? Well, the first thing I want to do is I want to try to convince you that understanding our attitudes to nature really matters. I think it matters more than any one piece of policy. It matters more than how much land we can protect or saving any one species. And I also want to outline where I think the Wildlife Trust fit into this conversation. And the second part, the bulk of my 40 minutes, is going to be interactive. So we're going to be exploring some attitudes to big issues using 2 to 3 case studies with that anonymized voting that Zoe alluded to. And then, as Zoe said again, the final piece is an unrecorded open Q&A session where we can go back and forth in a bit more detail on these issues. So, as an opening question, and just to warm you all up with Zoom polling to get you thinking a bit, I'd like to ask whether any of you might know what this animal is, this unfortunate animal. Not many people do, it turns out, but you might know, and I'd just love to get your kind of take on that, so we can kind of get used to the polling. So you should see something pop up on your screen where you can vote for what you think this animal might be. I'll just give you, I guess, 20 seconds or so. I think Zoe may well be seeing how many people have voted, and when we're ready, when we think the room has voted, we can see the results. And I'll have to communicate those results for those people who are watching this as a recording, because the recording won't show the pop-up. Lovely job. Okay, so looking at the results of that polling, for those of you watching the recording, 92% of those on the call think this is a harbour porpoise and 8% think this is a vaquita. And that 8%, you got it right, so well done. This animal is a vaquita. It is one of the smallest marine mammals, and if it isn't extinct, it is drastically close to extinction. There could be fewer than 10 left, and it lives in the Gulf of Mexico, if it still indeed exists. And I'm going to return to the vaquita in this session, because I think the story of this animal contains important lessons for how we go about protecting nature. And it's something that I think is worth focusing in on, just to kind of frame our thinking around doing effective conservation. I'm going to step sideways for a moment here to put the Wildlife Trust in context. I should say this is not a sales pitch. Instead, I just want to highlight a couple of things from this graphic that I think are relevant to the conversation. The first is that the Wildlife Trust is not a singular organisation. It's a movement of 47 independent charities working together for nature. We've got over 910,000 members, 2,600 staff, 35,000 volunteers, and almost as many nature reserves as we have staff. And that's a lot of people a lot of organizations all doing things in unique ways, all with differing priorities and objectives. And I guess the point I would like to make to you is that working with lots of different people and organizations and doing things in diverse ways is part of the DNA of the movement. And there is, I think, some value in this because we're used to working with people, organizations that have different positions on these key issues to us, sometimes only subtly and sometimes quite obviously. And I think that's important going forward. And take these two examples here that really exemplify those differences. On the left, we have a bison, amazing, big animal. It's a figurehead rewilding project run by Kent Wildlife Trust. Absolutely fantastic to see this animal back on the island of Britain. And on the right, we have an urban community garden project, both Wildlife Trust projects, seemingly and quite strikingly different, but actually fundamentally they're the same. They're both about doing the work of conservation and about protecting nature. And if you think about it for a moment, it's not surprising that different trusts might have different priorities and ways of doing things place to place. If you're a small island trust, then you might think, well, yes, we can actually manage and eradicate an invasive species. Whereas if you're a whole country of a trust, like the Scottish Wildlife Trust, then some forms of eradication on the mainland, at least, might not be tenable and your focus might be elsewhere. And indeed, within trusts, there are those that focus on these big rewilding projects and nature conservation from that angle, and there are those that focus on campaigns and communities. And I think that just goes to show there's no single right way to protect nature, and there's no single right way to prevent runaway climate change. Let's return to the vaquita again for a moment. Why is this animal so close to the brink? Well, we've had 3 decades of international conservation efforts, tens of millions of dollars spent, a large protected area for this animal, and yet there it is, right on the brink. Why have we failed so categorically to turn this ship around? Well, David Bader, who's been working on trying to protect this animal, says it better than I think most people can. He says our efforts were focused on the water when we should have been focused on the communities and people. If you don't give people a vested interest, if you don't give them a stake and a voice in this kind of work and in nature, then things are going to fail. And this is the key reason why this animal is on the brink now. And I think that just goes to show that we need to focus on the political and the social aspects of conservation to turn that ship around, because for the most part, the data's in very broadly on the ecology. We know broadly what's going wrong. We know broadly the direction things are moving in, and we know broadly what to do to fix it. So the project is in convincing people and giving them a stake. I'm going to step sideways again for just a moment, because you might say, well, Dan, working with communities and people sounds great in principle, but what happens when we can't agree? And aren't we living in a more polarized, more disagreeable time than ever before? Well, that's actually true to a degree, and it's something that we can observe in real data, particularly online. This paper on the right shows that people who are influential in the climate debate on one side or the other have always been polarized, but everyone else between the COPs has moved from a reasonably even spread across those positions to into camps, right? So we are polarizing in a very objective way, in a measurable way online. And so it's true that certain aspects of modernity seem hardwired to foster that polarization. But I think this makes it more vital for us to consciously work against that polarization, to listen and to empathize with others, and to create a coalition of the willing who will, despite some differences on key issues, work together to save nature. And again, not to be a salesman for the Wildlife Trust, but I think that the Wildlife Trust are quite good at having these difficult conversations, largely because of the way that we're formed. And if you take HS2 as an example, the Wildlife Trust happen to be on one side of this conversation, but we recognize that other environmentally minded people disagree with us in good faith. And this wildlife debate is worth catching on that issue if you've not seen it. There are some green groups who believe that HS2 is both good and necessary for the environment, and that is not the position of the Wildlife Trust in this case. But again, we can have a respectful debate and come to either agreeable disagreements, or we can find areas of common ground where we can work together, if not on this issue, then on others. And I think that's very important. I really love this cartoon. This cartoon, originally drawn by a guy called David McKay at the start of the pandemic, has been memed and imitated all over the world. And this particular form is a painting that I think appeared at a protest in Scotland. I could be wrong, but I think not. And I think that most of us in this call today probably think that that green wave, climate change, and that purple wave, biodiversity collapse, they are existential threats. And we agree, therefore, I think that something should be done to address those threats. And so the question then becomes, how and why should we go about doing that something? What does that look like? And that's where we may disagree. And there's so much in the how and the why. It's actually too much to fit into a single survey, as those of you who have done the survey will probably have discovered. But it's vital that we begin to have that conversation. And the Great Big Nature Survey aims to do just that. And there can never really be the right answers to some of these questions, like the role of hunting or the role of business. But that's okay, because the point of asking them is to get people thinking more about these issues. And the bottom line also is, from the Wildlife Trust point of view, if we're going to be effective advocates for our members and supporters, then we need to understand that viewpoint diversity on these key issues. So I hope that I've made a reasonably persuasive case to you for why we need to understand our attitudes to nature and conservation on these issues, and why we've asked some very tricky questions in the survey. It's not just an easy thing to do. And the survey very broadly captures things about the things we do for nature, things about our well-being with respect to access to nature and time we spend in nature, and that last piece, perhaps the trickiest bit, our attitudes and values to conserving nature. If you've not done the survey, you can scan that QR code or follow the link to do it. It's not necessary that you've taken the survey to get something out of this session, but it would be useful to do as an interesting follow-up. And if you have done the survey, then some of the questions you'll see in the following section will be going over statements that you've already addressed, but that's then an opportunity for us to consider them in more detail than perhaps we did in the first instance. So that's kind of the primer, if you like, and now I'd like to move on to the kind of interactive piece, the bulk of the session. And in this session, we're going to see pairs of statements from the survey, which you can vote to agree or disagree with to some extent. Remember that there are no correct answers here, and that the neutral option is a good choice if you're unsure what you think, or you think the answer that you would give depends on specifics. People that would join a webinar like this are probably very educated and nature-connected individuals that know a lot about these issues. And so that makes us different to random members of the public who might not have thought about these issues in some detail and might very instinctively and quickly answer those questions based on a hunch or a gut feeling. And I guess it's okay, therefore, if you answer neutral, because that just means I'm not sure, or it depends. The voting, again, is fully anonymized, and the exercise is really just a prompt to get us thinking about issues in the space. So let's move on to the first of three issues that we're going to cover. The first one is about the role of business in conservation. And this is another relatively famous cartoon that gets bandied around the internet. I think it really captures that negative stereotype of big business on the environment, where this chap is saying, yes, the planet got destroyed, but for a beautiful moment in time, we've created a lot of value for our shareholders. And that's the kind of stereotype, right? And I think to some degree it is sometimes true from a personal point of view, but is this always true? I think that depends. And let's get into the details on that in this following section. So to start us off, I'd like you to vote on these two statements. The first one is nature can be better protected with the support of business. And the second one is putting a cash value on nature helps to protect it. I think Zoe should bring up the questions and we can all vote on those and submit our answers. And again, once we're all finished, and I think Zoe has oversight of that, I will spend just a bit of time communicating what the results are to those who are watching this as a recording. Now, I actually personally don't find these ones to be too tricky, but other ones I definitely do. However, some people really do think, well, it just depends again. So I would just say go with whatever your hunch is, your best guess. And if you're unsure, again, neutral works. And if you've got some qualifications to make, we can do that in the Q&A. Okay, brilliant. Let me just scroll down the results and communicate them. So on the role of business, the idea that nature can be better protected with the support of business, 58% agree and 42% strongly agree, which is quite a clear-cut case of support for business in the room, which is interesting to note. It looks like there's a bit more of a split on putting a cash value on nature helps to protect it. So 17% disagree, 33% are neutral, and 50% agree. So there's, some kind of marginal support, I think, for the idea that cash valuing nature and ecosystem services could help us to protect it. Interesting stuff. Okay, let's dive into some of the details on that. And to do that, we're going to use trees. Trees are fantastic things, aren't they? They are the original carbon capture and storage technology. They're great for health. They're great for sucking up pollution. They're great for our well-being. They're great for sucking up carbon, and they're great for biodiversity when it's the right tree in the right place. So I think we can agree that trees are really quite good, and that planting more of them is generally a good idea. This is actually a relatively controversial paper from 2019, which shows the global potential for tree cover in the current climate. The authors of this paper estimate it at 4.5 billion hectares. But then when they exclude existing forests, when they exclude urban areas, and when they exclude agricultural areas, they still find there's room for perhaps about 1 billion hectares of trees to be planted. And that's a very big picture take. But the point of it is, whether you disagree with the exact number or not, is that we could plant a lot more trees, and it might be a good idea to plant trees. So, of course, environmental NGOs plant a lot of trees, individuals and communities and various initiatives plant trees, governments fund the planting of trees these days, and businesses get involved with the planting of trees. So what does that look like when businesses get involved? Well, I'd like to start with an example of when it goes wrong, where the creation of a carbon market, that is putting a cash value on nature, has unintended consequences. There's a Welsh village, and I won't try to pronounce it in case anyone's watching this recording and I just murder the pronunciation, and apologies to any Welsh speakers. I'm sorry. But there's a Welsh village that's become a battleground over the ethics of this kind of work. And the backstory to this is that the Welsh government's aiming for 43,000 hectares of new woodland to be planted by 2030. They're providing funding to do that. And there are companies operating in this offsetting market, in particular one called Foresight, that's doing this kind of work. And in this particular region, it's looked to plant about 60 hectares. But actually, what it's tried to do is to plant 3/4 non-native conifers, which are quite rubbish, quite frankly. They're no good. They're easy to plant and they grow fast, of course, but they're no good for biodiversity and not necessarily good for any associated ecosystem services. So as a result, we've got strong local opposition to that. And there's opposition from environmental groups. And there's accusations, I think perhaps rightly, of greenwashing here. And part of that is the perverse incentives created by this buoyant carbon offsetting market. And as a result, there's been a nearly 50% increase in land value between 2020 and 2021, driven in part by this. So that's the bad stuff. It's not all bad, right? I'd like to contrast it with a project based here in Devon, and this is Otter Brewery, who have this project initiative called Pints Means Trees. And what they're doing is that for every barrel of their beer they sell, they will plant a tree in Devon. It's crucial to note that this is part of the Saving Devon's Treescapes initiative, and it's led by Devon Wildlife Trust. And it works with local communities, and it's looking to plant, again, the right trees in the right place, not just non-native conifers all over the show. And it aims for 40,000 plus planted over 5 years. So that's a really positive case for the role of business in a conservation project, in my view. You might be skeptical of that. You might say, well, Dan, look, you're contrasting a relatively small scale thing, a local business doing local stuff, with perverse incentives in offsetting markets with large companies. But actually, I think it can in principle be done right at scale. And this is a project that Aviva has been involved with. They've recently awarded the Wildlife Trust 38 million quid to help restore Britain's temperate Atlantic rainforests. And I think that's the very definition of right tree in right place, right? This is not just random conifers all over the place. Again, it's Wildlife Trust led, it's Britain-wide, so it's at scale. And we have strict criteria for carbon credits. And again, we're working with communities. Now, this project is in its infancy. And I guess the proof of the pudding will be in the eating, or rather in the planting. But actually, I'm hopeful that this will be a good example of where a business can get involved in a conservation project at scale in Britain and do something really positive. So to wrap that up, for me, I think pragmatically, I think we can deliver better conservation outcomes with the support of business. But I'm a little bit more circumspect about putting a cash value on nature. And I think in particular, this is because I personally believe that nature has an intrinsic value. That is, it has a value beyond anything that it does for us. And we've seen the potentially unintended consequences of those carbon offsetting markets. I think there's hope to get them right, but it's clear that they have gone wrong in the past. And indeed, that screen grab of the Guardian article on the right is from today. So this is stuff which is happening as we speak almost. So details matter on that. Let's move on to the second issue. Perhaps and potentially the most divisive issue in conservation, I would say, the role of hunting in conservation. And again, I think this cartoon well captures that negative stereotype. The big game hunters, a shame versus a pride. Are they just horrendous people that just love killing animals? Or actually, does hunting have a role to play in conservation that's valuable? That's an important question that we need to answer. And to do so, I'm going to focus in primarily on this kind of trophy hunting aspect, which takes it out of the context of the UK. But it's worth bearing in mind that the policies that we enact here in the UK can have consequences in other parts of the world, of course, and this is no exception. So here's your next two statements. The first is, work to care for nature should benefit disadvantaged people the most. And that seems like a strange one, and it seems unrelated to the second, but it's worth considering. And the second one is, hunting should not be part of looking after nature because it harms individual animals. So if Zoe could bring up the polling, and we'll vote on those. This one to me always gets quite interesting responses, and if we want to get into it in the Q&A, I'd love to. Okay, lovely. So the results are in, and I'm going to read them out again for the benefit of those watching the recording. So there's a real clear split on this. So on the first statement, work to care for nature should benefit disadvantaged people the most. 27% disagree, 36% are neutral, 27% agree, and 9% strongly agree. So real spread there from disagree to agree. And on hunting should not be part of looking after nature because it harms individual animals, 27% strongly disagree, 36% are neutral, 27% agree, and 9% strongly agree. So again, a big spread. So as I suspected, these are two of the most divisive issues that we can address. So let's get into it. So recently, you may be aware that we've actually brought a ban on imports of animal hunting trophies, and that's become law. And my question is that an unequivocally good thing? My instinctual reaction is yes, it is a good thing because trophy hunting is a load of nonsense. But actually, when I've dug into this a bit more, I've changed my mind a little bit. And in particular, this open letter signed by African leaders, scientists, and NGOs, including Save the Rhinos, was quite compelling to me. And here's an excerpt that I'm going to read. The reality is that no land use alternative has yet been developed which equally protects the wildlife and habitats found in these vital landscapes, while also generating valuable revenues for local communities. So what they're saying is that hunting in this part of the world is actually fundamental to, I guess, the livelihoods of some quite disadvantaged people. And that's where I'm making this connection. And that's where those two statements hang together in this case. In the next section, I'm going to show you a short 2-minute video clip, which is about this issue. And it includes some footage of some people processing an elephant carcass. So just fair warning, as a content warning, if that is an issue for you personally, then please do mute it for 2.5 minutes and then rejoin us.
With animal populations in Africa falling by more than 1/3, it's no wonder celebrities and the rich are being slammed for photos like this. These hunting enthusiasts pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to track and shoot these endangered animals for a thrill and experience that, to them, can't be matched by a photographic safari. While prominent animal activists like Ed Sheeran and Ricky Gervais have called for bans on trophy hunting, many African countries aren't so sure it's the right solution. In Namibia, hunting has surprisingly been part and parcel of the constant battle to preserve and conserve endangered animals. Tightly regulated trophy hunting is funding Namibia's conservation effort. The program grants communities of the country the power to manage wildlife, allowing for limited numbers in hunting and kill permits for problem animals. The profits from this blood sport can add more than $70 million to the economy each year, which incentivizes local communities to further conservation efforts and keep things above board.
Removing trophy hunting or banning trophy hunting would have the same effect that COVID-19 is having on these communities, because they have been relying on the dividends from the trophy hunting.
The results are promising. Elephant numbers are on the rise in Namibia, and other vulnerable species like giraffes and buffalo have seen growing populations. Without the economic incentive, it can be very difficult to convince people on the ground to protect endangered wildlife. But the system isn't without its faults. A CNN report revealed permits to kill problem animals have been issued before the animals were even identified, while illegal poaching remains the biggest issue plaguing conservation efforts, fueled by a growing demand for goods like ivory in Asia. For many countries dealing with the dilemma, regulated game hunting might just be the better of two evils.
Okay, I think that's a reasonably succinct kind of overview of the issue, and it's not just that conservation actions should benefit disadvantaged people the most. It's actually in this case that a conservation action, the banning of trophy imports, might harm some of the most disadvantaged people in the world in terms of their livelihoods, and it might harm conservation outcomes, which again is some series of unintended consequences from people that actually have good intentions around this issue, whether they be on one side or the other. It's obviously a divisive issue, but it makes it all the more important to recognise people's perspectives, whilst recognising that both sides can care deeply about nature in quite different ways. In the UK, just to touch on that very briefly, it's clear that some things that are framed as conservation on the hunting side don't have good outcomes. So, for example, you can see from this paper on the left that hen harriers are much more likely to disappear on grouse moors than in any other part of the country, and that suggests illegal persecution. On the other hand, red deer in Scotland without apex predators kind of run amok and do a lot of damage to forest ecosystems. So culling them is actually, I think, quite a valuable conservation intervention, and that's culling essentially means hunting, right? So the picture's varied in the UK, and it just depends on what kind of hunting we're talking about and how it's done. So is it a force for good in conservation? Again, I think the details matter. And without getting into the specifics on my positions in too much detail, I'm kind of broadly for hunting and conservation. And I think that animal suffering occurs whether it be from wild animals or whether it be through some of our interventions in conservation. So we should, of course, try to minimize suffering, but we can never completely eliminate it to do good conservation. That's my own personal point of view. And there's other conservationists who, in good faith, completely disagree with that. Okay, I'm just conscious of time, and I think we're doing pretty well. So I'll skip through to the final of those three issues so that we've got enough time to chat about these issues back and forth in the Q&A session. The final set is on rewilding and the value of wildlife. I really like this cartoon because I think it unintentionally reveals a truth about rewilding. It's not that rewilding is something that always has to be done in these grand nature reserves somewhere far away from people and the negative influences that we have. But actually it can be something that's done in towns and cities by normal everyday people. And some people think that rewilding is a jargony term for restoring nature, but I think it's quite distinctive because of a focus on interactions, not species, and in interaction-driven management. And to understand rewilding, we need to understand a bit about what we mean by wildness. So let's just pause on these final two statements and consider them. Animals that used to be found here should be brought back, even if they cause some problems. And wild nature is more important than nature found in places shaped by people, like farms and parks. So Zoe, if you could bring up the voting. Thank you. Good to see that everyone's getting the hang of the Zoom voting as well. And for me personally, these issues are relatively cut and dry, whereas I'm a bit more circumspect about some of the hunting issues. Great, so the results are in, and again, I will just read them out for the benefit of those watching the recording. So on the first statement, species that used to be found here should be brought back even if they cause some problems. 7% strongly disagree, 29% disagree, 57% are neutral, and 7% agree. So that is actually a relatively negative center of mass on that first issue, which is interesting and actually surprising to me, but I like surprises, that's good. And then secondly, wild nature is more important than nature found in places shaped by people like farms and parks. Again, a bit of a spread. So 14% strongly disagree, 43% disagree, 21% are neutral, and 21% agree. So again, this is something which does cause a division in perspectives, which is important to note. So let's get into it. And this is sort of like a bit of a top trumps run through of what we might mean by from here, by invasive, and by wild, going with some quite common animals and plants. So let's start with the grey squirrel. And these are kind of my takes on what these animals are. I think mostly people agree, but sometimes you might be surprised and disagree. So I think the grey squirrel it's not from here, it's from North America, clearly. I think it is invasive, and I think, in my view, it's not a wild animal, and some people do disagree on that. If you live in a city and you come across this animal in a park, you might consider it to be wildlife, and it might be quite valuable to your experience of nature. A beaver. To me, this is from here, although again, some people would disagree because it's been out of action before reintroduction for hundreds of years. I said it's clearly not invasive and it's clearly wild, and I don't think many people would disagree on those 2 points. Zebra mussels. These are a freshwater mussel that has invaded from the Pontic-Caspian region. And the from here part for me is uncertain, because this animal was here pre-glaciation. It was native here pre-glaciation, and it's just, you could argue it's recolonizing land that it once existed in. It is invasive, and again, some people would say, and I would say, this is not wild in the strictest sense. But again, some people might disagree if they come across it when they're out and about, and they might consider this to be wildlife. The red deer is clearly from here. I think this is invasive, and this is not because of its geographic distribution, but it's because it finds itself in a novel ecological context. There's no high predators to threaten it. So it is invasive by that definition of invasive, and it's still wild. So in this scheme, things can be wild and invasive and not wild and invasive. And finally, rosemary. Now, this is an interesting one. I would say it's not from here. It's likely introduced by the Romans. I would say it's not invasive. And again, the wildness question is an open one to me. And all I want to do with this set is to just illustrate that what we consider to be wild, it's always going to be a little bit contingent, and always wraps up some of our values about, you know, what sort of is here and was here recently, and maybe was brought here and is quote unquote naturalized. And that's important to bear in mind when we consider what rewilding is and what wildness itself is. Let's focus in on beavers for a moment, particularly because Devon and Cornwall Wildlife Trust have done a lot of work here with flagship reintroductions underpinned by careful research and monitoring. It's clear that a subset of the media take a negative framing of beaver reintroductions, but actually when we look at what people think about this, 82% of the public support species reintroductions. 76% of people would like to see beavers reintroduced, which makes them by far the most popular mammal for reintroduction. And we have some well-evidenced ecological effects of these introductions. And to home in on Devon again, we know that they have these incredible effects on mitigating the impacts of drought and of flood. And we have emerging evidence from, in this case, the River Tail here in Devon, of a positive association between beaver-engineered wetlands and water voles, which again is fantastic. And it's worth just saying, we've got a lot of evidence for these animals doing good things in the environment. And I guess that matters when we make the case for reintroducing them. And they do cause some problems, of course. up in Scotland, they flooded certain areas of farmland, and they've had to cull quite a few as a result, and that's quite a controversial thing to do. But this is to say that most introductions aren't without some issues. But here's a question for you. Should we hang our hat on the things that species do to make the case for reintroductions? Not everything has such profound effects as the beaver. Not everything can be a keystone species. So the lynx, we know it has some effects on deer populations, but it's not an ecosystem engineer in the same way that the beaver is. But does that matter? I mean, when I see a beaver, I'm an ecologist, right? And I think less about the amazing things it does and its ecology. I just think, wow, that's a beaver. That's so cool. I'm just really happy that, you know, my daughter can grow up in a world where the most interesting thing she might see out and about is something like this and not a Frisian cow. And I guess there is some instrumental value there, but actually, I think this just goes to show that there is perhaps some case to be made that some of these animals have an intrinsic value and an intrinsic right perhaps to be here. So we don't always need to hang our hat on the things these animals do, I think, to make the case for a reintroduction. I'm just going to make a quick note on the value of wildness, and I'm going to do that using this place here, Canby Wick. Canby Wick is a disused oil refinery in the kind of Thames Valley part of the world. And it is, if not the most, certainly one of the most diverse sites for insects that we have in the whole of the UK. This is our tropical rainforest. This is where all the life is. This is where stuff is happening, and it just looks like a scruffy mess, right? There are 30 red listed species here, and this just goes to show that this is the kind of new wild in a way. And it goes to show that things that we might not consider wilderness and wild have tremendous objective value from the perspective of biodiversity, and we shouldn't ignore that. And nature can thrive in places shaped by people. Here in Devon, you've got your old sludge beds and you've got Meath Quarry. And those are two places that are basically ex-industrial, that have been repurposed and reclaimed by nature. And you might even find that there's more stuff going on here for certain groups of animals and plants than up on Dartmoor, which is the kind of grand part of this part of the world, right? And I think that matters. The second major benefit that nature in places shaped by people has is that it connects people to nature where they are. And this is exactly what our community-led Next on Nature project is all about. It's pretty clear that nature thrives where we give people a stake and an opportunity to benefit from nature on their terms. This doesn't mean we're going to see, you know, wolves roaming the streets. So there's always going to be a place for that more extensive, that kind of grand rewilding where we have the space to do it. But this does not necessarily mean it has greater value than the rewilding we can do in our urban spaces. Things like the Big Spring Sow and the Greener Neighbourhoods programme are quite exemplary of that kind of approach. And that takes us finally all the way back to that cautionary tale of the Fakita. I kind of hope and believe that animals like this can be saved and that nature can be put into recovery, but this is only going to happen where everyone has a stake in the process and has the right incentives and has a voice. And that is in part what the Great Big Nature Survey is about. It's about giving us a chance to voice those opinions on these issues. And it's in part what this session is about. And this is just the sort of beginning of a conversation. So for those of you that are watching this as a recording, this is where we break off to talk about some of these issues. So for those of you watching this as a recording, thank you very much for giving us the time of day. I hope you found it interesting and enjoyable. I'm very happy to go back and forth on any of the issues that we've discussed here today with you. Please get in touch, and my details are at the start of the presentation. Feel free to drop me a line or email me or shout me on Twitter, and I'm happy to have a chat. That would be fantastic. Thank you very much.